So kind of minor update for you guys today. This is MegaLab. I'm sure you've seen this in plenty of my videos. It's my testing Proxmox system. Whenever I make a video, there's a good chance that I'm testing it out on this one first. So MegaLab has a problem, and that problem is SSD wear out. So I've got a SATA M.2 in this thing. I bought it for an old project a long time ago where I had to have SATA. It's wearing out. It's only 500 gigs, so today I'm going to upgrade it. FIO offered to send over an SSD to me as long as I tested it out. So here it is. This is the FIO FN955. It's a 2 terabyte DRAM-less NVMe SSD. The one I already had in there was also DRAM-less, so hopefully this will be a little bit faster. This is TLC, so tri-layer flash memory. And this guy is going in there. I mean, it's bigger, so with the amount of stuff I'm storing, it'll have 4 times as long to wear out, at least. It's also brand new, so it's not worn yet. And so yeah, come on along, and I'm going to migrate my existing ZFS pool, my boot pool, from the old SSD to the new SSD, show you how to set that up, get that expanded. Come along in this adventure. So it came with an itty bitty little screwdriver, and oh, there was a screw in the box. Did I already lose it? Shit. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I got the SSD itself. It's got a little label on both sides. It's going in that slot there. It came with a tiny screwdriver, which is nice, and a tiny screw, which is also nice. But I'm missing the standoff, and I think I took the standoff to hold down the other SSD. I think this is the right size. Bigger. So I'm going to take the standoff off and replace it with tape. Put the standoff back over there where it belongs. Screw down the new FIO SSD. This one I'm just going to hold in with tape because it's coming out soon. If you're doing this yourself, hopefully your motherboard already has a standoff installed. Get in there, come on, don't cross thread. This is like double-sided duct tape, but it's what I have on my bench today. So it's what I'm gonna use. So they put a sticker over the screw, which is nice, so we don't lose it. So here we go, going in the slot. This board is kind of odd. It has one M.2 NVMe, NVMe only, and one that's SATA only. So, I don't know, that's how they did it. On this platform, the NVMe goes straight to the CPU, so I'm not going through the chipset. It is still only Gen 3 with this CPU, but that's okay. It's still a lot faster than the SATA I was doing before. So now we power it up, and the way we power it up is by shorting. What buttons are there? These two. There we go. So now let's go into Proxmox and see how we migrate this drive over. So before I put the new drive in service, I kicked off a benchmarking run. I'm using the Linux tool FIO, the Flexible I/O Tester. I also pulled a script that someone else wrote off of GitHub, which will batch automate these tests. So we'll have data on sequential reads and writes, random reads and writes through a bunch of different I/O depths. Be nice. Now, of course, these tests take a while, so got a snack. We're going to talk about DRAM-less and host memory buffer SSDs. A little history lesson from Appleard. Long ago, in the days of spinning Rust, we would have to address where our data was on the Rust. So we'd use a term called CHS, cylinder head sector. That's a huge pain in the ass for software. So eventually, we decided that the way to address fixed medium was logical block addressing, or LBA. This was the index into the block. So the hard drive controller would be responsible for dealing with how big the drive was. We would just say, I want block number 100. Traditionally, blocks were 512 bytes. Modern devices actually use 4096. That's how you get a shift of 12 in ZFS. 2 to the 12 is 4096. Some drives still tell you they're 512. Because, I don't know, Windows is stupid or something, but in reality, they're pretty much all 4096 now. Then came flash memory, and flash memory had a quirk we weren't prepared for. The flash memory wears out when you use it. I mean, hard drives wear out too, but they wear out from like spinning and from turning on and off and things like that. Flash memory wears out when you erase it. So every time you program it, you have to then erase it to use it again, and that physically wears out the flash memory cells. So life is primarily based on how many times you've programmed and erased them, which is how many times you've written to the disk. So, to prevent some operating system from having a bunch of files that it never touches, that it just reads, that sit there forever pristine, and having some other files, like say log files, that it reads and writes to continuously, those particular cells on disk, or on flash, would end up getting destroyed more quickly. So to deal with this, flash memory controllers implemented something called wear leveling. Basically, every time the operating system writes to a block, the flash memory controller will put it somewhere that doesn't have as much wear on it. And over time, it'll keep moving blocks around so that it's always writing to the end of the disk, coming back to the beginning. If the blocks haven't moved in a while, it'll move them anyway, just so it can reuse that block and level the wear across all the different cells. So as part of wear leveling, the flash memory controller has a table, and it says, the operating system gave me block 100. I put it over in physical block 420. And then if it ever moves that block, it updates the table. If the operating system reads block 100, it knows to go to physical block 420, turn the data. So that means that every time we do an I/O operation, we have to either read from the indirection table or allocate a new entry in the indirection table. And that kind of adds some latency to our steps. Unlike a spinning drive, we can't just go seek to that address. We have to read the indirection table, walk it, find where our physical block is, and then we have to go there. So this thing I've been waving around is a really old PCIe flash drive. It's an I/O memory, Fusion I/O drive. So these guys predate NVMe, and they relied on a kernel driver in Linux to do the indirection. So when the Linux kernel wanted to access a block, it would keep a copy of that indirection table in system memory, it would walk the table, and then it would tell the hardware what physical block it needed. That was much more efficient because the physical hardware just has to be flash memory, and in this case it's an FPGA, because they didn't have flash controller ASICs back then, they did PCIe. But it also means that that indirection table is stored in the Linux kernel in system memory. So when the industry moved to a more generic interface, either reusing SATA or eventually the NVMe standard, they needed a way to emulate that old LBA addressing that we had back in the day of spinning Rust, and do that at a hardware level, not relying on a kernel driver. So now in modern SSDs, the controller chip, which in this guy is under the big heatsink, that will do this indirection lookup, and it will store the indirection table in its memory. So now, higher-end SSD controllers include a DRAM chip, either on the controller itself or as a separate chip, that stores all of the indirection tables and all of the other information the wear leveling algorithm needs. So when the controller does wear leveling, it goes to its fast DRAM, uses that as a cache of all of the indirection, all of the wear leveling information, so the reads and writes go right on through to the flash pretty quickly. Lower-end controllers don't have a cache, so they have to go back to the flash memory, read stuff, write stuff from flash memory every time they do an operation, and this is slower. Now with modern NVMe SSDs, there's an intermediate option that is called the host memory buffer. Basically, the NVMe device asks for some number of megabytes of memory from the host system to use for its own purposes. And so this way, the flash controller can access host memory over PCI Express. It's not quite as fast as having your direct DRAM, and it's also not as big, but it can cache some of its wear leveling information and do stuff relatively quickly without the cost of an entire DRAM chip on the controller. So this particular SSD that I have is that variety. It uses host memory buffer. I can go into Linux. I can verify it's using host memory buffer. In this case, it's using 40 megabytes of host memory. So we don't know what it's using that for, but it's using it for something involved in its wear leveling routines. So this is the path that most consumer SSDs are going down now. They're getting rid of DRAM on board, and they're using host memory buffer to fill in the gap. Oh wow, look at that. FIO finished. Now we have data. So this is a lot more data than something like you get from Crystal Disk Mark. Basically, on the x-axis, we have the size of each request, kilobytes. Each line is a I/O depth, so the number of I/Os happening at once, the number of parallel requests outstanding. And then the y-axis is throughput in megabytes per second. So over here for random reads, we're hitting 3,500 megabytes per second pretty consistently at any I/O depth greater than 1. That just so happens to be very close to the maximum bandwidth of PCI Express Gen 3 by 4 lanes, which is what I have this hooked up as. So we're saturating the PCI bus. Random writes show a bit of a different story. For large requests, we're able to get to almost 3,000, so not quite saturating PCI Express on the random write side. Sequential reads, again, very similar to random reads. So for hard drives in particular, sequential and random often has a big difference because the hard drive has to physically seek its little arm back and forth. SSDs don't have to do that. If they have the whole indirection table in memory, they shouldn't have any time difference between random and sequential reads, and it looks like this is pretty much the case. Now sequential writes are a bit different. In this case, it's also able to mostly saturate the PCI Express bus roughly in write mode. So, given that I'm satisfied with the performance of the drive, let's get our boot drive copied over, get ZFS happy, grub happy, the EFI loader, all that good stuff. So in Proxmox, there are 4 things we need to copy to create a new boot disk. So, like any disk, the first thing we need is the partition table. So on virtually all modern systems, this is a GPT style table. This is basically a list of all of the different partitions on the drive, where they are, how big they are, what format they are, and what their UUID is. So we need to create a new partition table on the drive that fits the new sizes of the new drive, but also has all the boot partitions and stuff at the beginning. Then the first partition is almost a megabyte. That's the grub loader. So if you're using legacy BIOS style booting, you'll need a grub loader. Second partition is the EFI system partition. If you're using EFI, you need this partition. But also, this is where all the Linux images and initrds are stored. So whether or not you're using EFI or the grub loader, you always need the EFI partition, at least with Proxmox. And the third partition, this is where the bulk of our data goes. In this case, this is ZFS. So 4 things to copy: partition table, grub loader, EFI system partition, ZFS partition. Let's get on that. So I come here and I can run ls block on my 2 devices, SDA and NVMe. We can see we have our 3 partitions here. So that's the grub loader, a little under a meg. That's the EFI partition, ½ gig. And this is ZFS. So that's the rest of the drive. And then the NVMe drive is unpartitioned. So we're going to use a tool called sfdisk. We're going to dump dev SDA. So it looks like this. So this is all the information about the partition table on dev SDA. So it tells us how big the drive is, etc. And then we have 3 partitions and how big they are. So we're going to save this to a file and call it parts. So this file contains a list of all the partitions, but it's also the commands back to sfdisk to create a partition table, because it dumps in the same format that it receives. So now we're going to edit this file we created and tweak it a bit to match our new partition table. So nano parts. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete last LBA. So this is where the end of the drive is, and since the new drive is bigger, that can go away. Next up, we have 3 partitions, and these are all fine, but they need to not have a UUID. So when a partition is created, a randomly generated UUID is used, and a lot of things in Linux will mount by UUID, and it's really bad if we have duplicates. So if we delete them, that'll tell sdisk that it needs to recreate new ones when it generates the new partition table. So we're just going to backspace the UUID, but we're going to leave the type. And then for the last partition, the data partition, I'm going to replace the size with a single dash. This tells sfdisk to fill the entire disk. So this last partition, the ZFS partition, will just fill up the whole drive, however big it is. Let's save that. So now we just have to tell sfdisk to run these commands. So we're going to cat this file back into sfdisk. Dev NVMe ON1 parts. So now it's going to tell us the partition table's been altered. So that means it's done. It's also going to reload the partition table. So if we run ls block again, we see we have our partitions on the old drive and we have our partitions on the new drive. And this fills out the whole drive, 1.8 terabytes. So next up, we need to copy these 3 partitions. And the strategy I'm going to take varies a little bit based on what's on the partition. So first partition is the grub loader. We're just going to copy it with DD. So that's for my source. OF is NVMe 0 N1P1. Go. There we go. Done. Next up, for the EFI partition, Proxmox boot tool will copy all the data to it, but it needs a valid file system. And one of the easy ways to do that is just to copy the other file system with DD again. So we'll run DD, and this time we'll do partition 2. It'll take a little bit, and then it'll be copied. Then we're going to run Proxmox boot tool init, and we're going to say grub. If you're using EFI boot, you don't say grub, you just leave the grub off. So now for ZFS. Since the system is running, we can tell ZFS to add this as a mirror. So I currently have dev SDA3 as my ZFS partition. I'm going to turn that into a mirror with SDA3 and NVMe ON1P3. So if we look at zpool status, so our pool is named rpool. We see it did a scrub and it's pretty happy, and it has this one drive. So now we're going to do zpool attach. Pool name is rpool. So then we need to copy this guy here. So I'm just going to paste him in. And then our new drive, which is dev NVMe 0N1P3. Now if we status, you can see they are both there. And there is a resilver in progress. So ZFS is now going to read every block off the disk, copy it to the new disk, then we can detach it in ZFS once this resilver is done, then I can reboot the system to remove the old drive. So it has now been 1 week since I did that migration, despite the fact that I'm wearing the same shirt. It's from Veronica Explains, by the way. The system was running just fine with a ZFS mirror, so I did a ZFS detach. That's where you take a mirror and you split out one of the drives from the mirror, so it becomes a single drive. After that, I shut down the system, pulled out the drive, rebooted it, booted up fine to the new drive. So no issues with the grub loader, EFI loader, all of that was just fine. It found the new rpool, or I guess it's the same rpool on a different drive, booted into it. System is running great. If you're interested in buying the drive in this video, I have a link to Amazon down below for that. If you'd like to support me, I have a Ko-fi as well. If you'd like to chat with me, Discord server, link down below for all these things. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next adventure.